Okay, everybody. Rosemary Brown, who's the infant feeding coordinator at the Whittington Hospital.
Actually, Whittington Health in Islington.
Whittington Health in Islington is going to give us a tour through the new guidelines on child nutrition. There we go. Over to you, Rosemary. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. I think, probably like all the other speakers, to try and do it in a fairly short time to cover the whole of nutrition when actually you could spend weeks talking about it is quite a challenge. And some of the guidelines are new and some of them aren't particularly new, but I'm sure you've all seen the booklets from the Department of Health, a new guide to bottle feeding, the introducing solids and so on. And what I'm going to try and do is just give a kind of an overview of what we're trying to achieve in terms of nutrition for children, and maybe some of the ways in which we can achieve it. And at the end, at the end of the handout, actually, you've got some references too, but I'll also hopefully have time to show those to you. Now, there was a clock on here, but it seems to have gone off. I don't know. Anyway, okay, so what are we aiming for? Well, I think the first thing, perhaps, in anything we do with children is that we want a happy, secure child who's enjoying and forming good relationships. And we know that those relationships are laid down and happen through the closeness that they have with the people around them, and that feeding is actually part of that. Feeding is always more than just about food, and so it's really, really important that when we're thinking about relationships that we tie that all in with what we're doing in terms of feeding. We know that it's been mentioned before, how in those early days babies are born with many brain cells, but they're laying down those connections that will enable them to build up healthy pathways to use the brain cells that they have and enable them to cope with life. And one of the main ways that they do that is through. We also want a happy and healthy and active child that's able to enjoy life both now and later, and is developing the skills, fulfilling the potential that they're born with. We want a child who enjoys food, but without feeding becoming a battleground. And I think probably all of us have met families where it has become a battleground and is a source of great anxiety for both parents and children, and that's what we don't want. And we know that that can lead on to eating difficulties later on in life and weight problems and things like that. And we want a child who eats enough for their needs, but not too much. You always think, is that child real? But I kind of made sure to see, was it something to do with the photograph? But no, that's actually a child. And I think it's rather sad, isn't it? Really sad. And how can we achieve that? Well, I think there are three main ways that we can do that. We need to encourage what will build those positive relationships right from the very beginning. We need to harness the child's inbuilt ability to regulate his or her own intake and not override that. And we want to enhance parents' knowledge, skills and confidence in enabling that development of healthy eating skills and habits throughout their life span from the beginning. We know that the government recommendations since 2003, based on the 2001 WHO recommendations, are that babies ideally should be breastfed exclusively for the first 6 months and then continue to breastfeed whilst we start offering solid foods from around 6 months of age. So how does breastfeeding help? I haven't got time. I could spend a long time talking about breastfeeding. But we know that actually breastfeeding does help in all these different areas. So the hormones of breastfeeding, prolactin and oxytocin, and the physical closeness that comes through a mum breastfeeding her child actually facilitate all that we've talked about, those connecting up those helpful pathways in the brain, actually stimulating all those protective instincts and love in the mum, that tiger instinct to protect her child. They stabilise the baby's heart rate, the breathing, the temperature, the blood sugar, and they calm the baby and actually help the mum to relax and feel more rested, even though actually she's coping with much less sleep than she's been used to. So there's both that physical closeness, but also those two hormones are really, really crucial in that. And in building those good relationships right from the beginning. It also harnesses all the baby's skills. You know, babies aren't born helpless. We know that all mammal babies actually have the skills to get themselves to where they're going to find food if we don't get in the way. And I think for a very long time with human babies, we have got in the way. But thankfully now, with encouraging skin to skin at birth and as often as possible afterwards, and especially if a mum's having difficulties breastfeeding, we see that stimulating all those baby skills that will get them where they need to go: the rooting, the stepping, the pushing up, the grasping, the suckling, the using their cheeks to get to the breast. And all of those is actually developing the skills that they develop their jaw muscles through breastfeeding. They get good mouth development. So the actual action of feeding is not just about feeding, it's about development in many other ways. And then we know that breastfeeding is custom-made food for the baby, and it adapts to meet the changing needs of the baby from feed to feed, and from day to day, from preemie to a term baby at 6 months, from day and night. It's constantly changing. It's a living fluid. We know, and I won't go into details about this, but that it contains many ingredients that aren't present or active in formula. Despite what the manufacturers say, there's basically no independent evidence for most of the claims they make about what they've added to formula to try and mimic breast milk. And breast milk, of course, contains many protective factors, and that lowers the incidence of infection and illness for the child, also for the mother, and that enables that child to be well and active. We talked just now about antibodies passing through in breast milk, and nearly every nutritional factor in breast milk is actually also protective in one way. And we know that there's a third of the risk of SIDS if you're breastfed. I'm just giving a couple of examples: reduced risk of breast and ovarian cancer for mum, 15% fewer GP visits in that first 6 months, and that is really significant, I think, for the child's ability to start interacting with their environment and being healthy to do that, but also from the mum's and parents' anxiety and even later on for work situations, and lots of decreased hospital admissions. And you may or may not know that the Department of Health now actually produce figures looking at breastfeeding prevalence in different parts of the country and comparing it with hospital admissions for chest infections, gastroenteritis and so on. And it's really clear from those figures that in areas where the breastfeeding prevalence is high, even in areas of high social deprivation, the admission rates are significantly lower than in other areas that might be actually better off areas but have lower breastfeeding rates. So it's worth maybe looking on the Department of Health website if you're interested in that. And it also facilitates the baby regulating their intake to meet their needs. So they have hunger cues that enable the parent to respond to the baby's needs as they need it. They also have more control over the flow and how much they take. And I know that's one of the things with breastfeeding, that actually it's more difficult for parents to know how much the baby's getting. But, you know, there are ways that they can know, even though they can't see. But it does enable that baby to actually have some control. There's also, there are also hormones in breast milk, including leptin, and that's a hormone that we think regulates appetite and regulates the way that we use energy and we metabolize energy, and that it's probably involved in that self-regulation of how much you actually take in. Breastfed babies also learn to recognise when they're full. It seems that that emerges over the first few weeks of breastfeeding. It may partly be the fact that at the end of the feed that you've got a higher fat concentration, and that can actually tell them, right, I'm getting to the end, I've had enough. We're learning more about it all the time. We don't know totally the mechanisms, but it's certainly there. And there's lower protein and energy in breast milk, and that reduces the deposition of fat and therefore leads to a lower risk of obesity. And there's lots of studies, that we're not sure quite how much it lowers the risk of obesity. There's been different studies saying different things, but I think most studies would say there's definitely some protective element. So that's what breastfeeding does. And I'm not going to go into this, but the important things for us, I think the crucial things for us, and I know the new birth visit is so pressured, but we've got to help those mums ensure that effective attachment. And this will be in your handout, but I think it's really quite a useful mnemonic, CHINS, the kind of key points to look at. And I think the nose to nipple one is a really crucial one. Most of the reasons for problems is the baby's just a few millimetres too far round towards the underarm of the mum. And that using the breastfeeding assessment ourselves, but also actually empowering that mum to look for all these things will actually enable her to be confident. And that's crucial, because actually even in areas of the world, I worked in Africa for a long time, in Kenya, where most people breastfeed, but actually confidence that breast milk is enough is still not there. So lots of other things are introduced quite early. It's these things that will give those mums confidence that actually their baby's getting enough, or tell them, I need to get some help. So I think this is really important. So what about bottle feeding? I think the problem in a way with bottle feeding is that we can sometimes override those signals, because the intake depends to some degree on the fact that the teat will stimulate the baby to suckle whether they're hungry or not. Just the action of the teat on the roof of the mouth. The size of the teat, of course, determines the flow. The expectations of the mum, or what they read on the side of the tin, or society, may determine how much they give and how often they give it. And it tends to be more mother-led. And the other thing about it is it can involve less interaction. It's easier to actually bottle feed a baby when you're not interacting with them. And it's actually easier to hand your baby round to lots of different people if you're bottle feeding. And as we said already, it's really crucial that that baby builds up a really strong relationship with their mother or their primary carer, and that we actually limit the number of caregivers. And that's why the new bottle feeding leaflet is not just about making up feeds and sterilising bottles. It's got a lot more than that. And in fact, there's more information to go with their baby friendly website that kind of gives some more information. But that's why now we're talking about that it's really important with bottle feeding to make sure that too, as much as possible, is responsive. So holding the baby close, having that eye contact, having those smiles, talking to that baby, limiting the number of caregivers that baby has, especially in those early months, and watching and following the baby's hunger cues. They will still have them, but we need to help parents look for them. And of course that also means that the baby needs to be where the mum is so that she can actually notice those hunger cues. And that's during the day as well as during the night. It's also important to allow the baby to have some control over the feeding. So allow them, hold the teat at their mouth and allow them to draw it in, rather than, it's very easy to shove a bottle in a baby's mouth, isn't it? And that's one of the things as well about multiple caregivers, is that we all have a different way of bottle feeding a baby, and that baby then has to cope with lots of different people feeding it in different ways. So it's important that the baby draws it into their mouth, that we take the bottle out from time to time, so that we really find, do they really want some more? Because of the way that the teat will stimulate sucking and swallowing, whether they want more or not. And of course, using the first stage milk all the way through until they start cow's milk at a year. It was worrying that in the recent diet and nutrition survey, I think it was quite a lot. Was it 34%? I think I can look that up later. But a significant number of babies were on follow-on formula between 4 and 6 months. And we know that it's not suitable at least until 6 months, and it's not necessary after 6 months. So I think we have to talk to parents about the way that things are marketed. That's what they're seeing the adverts for, isn't it? But unfortunately, that's meaning they're tending to use it. And the first stage milk is both adequate and the most like breast milk. And let the baby touch and hold the bottle, so be involved with that process, and let them decide the quantity, especially in those early months. They can help us know whether they want more or less, and it's a little bit allowing that baby to do that, to take more one time and less another time, and not worrying about that, maybe feeding more often sometimes, and looking at what the baby takes over the course of a day or over the course of a few days rather than each feed. The only thing with bottle feeding is that sometimes some babies won't naturally so easily reduce their milk intake as they start eating a significant amount of solids. So it's just worth helping parents to kind of look out for that, really. Okay, what about solids? Well, if you're anything like me, you were around when we used to advise starting solids at 3 to 4 months. And we didn't think there was anything untoward about that. And I think that one of the problems was when the change came in, people weren't quite sure as to why that change had actually happened. Unfortunately, I think the recommendation came in, and although there was a lot of research done and reviews of research formed the basis of that decision, I don't think that was very well communicated at the time. But we do now know a lot more about the adequacy of breast milk, the benefits of continuing breastfeeding, and actually how the development of the baby often matches what they need to be taking. And so we do want to wait for starting solids until they're developmentally ready to cope well and eagerly with them. That's the evidence that we have at the minute, that it's the best thing to wait, that their development, which makes sense, will match what they need to be taking. And when they need to take solids, they'll have the skills to do it. We want to wait till breast milk and formula no longer meets all their needs. While it does, breast milk is a complete food in many ways. And the quality of breast milk doesn't get less around about 6 months. It's just that the baby's needs increase. And it's usually around about 6 months. And we want to continue to allow the baby to control their own intake. And that's why there's more emphasis on allowing the baby to feed themselves. And I think one of the things about that is knowing what evidence we have. It's actually quite difficult to do research on feeding babies, because to randomize babies to one thing or the other has ethical issues about doing it. And so we haven't got masses and masses of evidence for any kind of feeding, but there's increasing evidence, and I'll tell you later about a really useful review of evidence for baby-led feeding, which I found very helpful and is freely available on the web. And we want that baby, just like we talked right at the beginning, to be able to develop the skills and a good eating lifestyle for now and for later. So why from about 6 months? Well, we know the research that has really recently come out shows that that breast milk does have the energy that baby needs for growth until they get to 6 months, and also is adequate for adequate iron stores. And this was research done by some of the paediatricians who wrote the article in the BMJ a couple of years ago. Do you remember that? Questioning the 6-month guideline. And kind of undermined it, I think, in some of our minds and some of the parents' minds. But they went to Iceland, where there's higher breastfeeding rates, and did randomise children to either 4 months exclusive breastfeeding and then starting solids with continued breastfeeding, or 6 months exclusive breastfeeding. And these were the results that they got from that research. They also found that if you do give something else, it displaces breast milk. So if we want to continue breastfeeding and not reduce the breast milk supply, then continuing that exclusive breastfeeding for the 6 months is the best thing. And there is some evidence that certainly introducing solids before 4 months does lead to an increased risk of obesity. At 6 months, or around about 6 months, their body systems are mature and they have the needed enzymes that are there to break down the food. We know that certainly before 4 months, those aren't there in sufficient quantity. And there is some evidence that suggests that if a child is still breastfeeding when introducing solids, it reduces the risk of allergies and things like celiac disease, and also can reduce the risk of hospitalisation. So continued breastfeeding is really important. And I don't know about you, but I think sometimes parents hear you breastfeed for 6 months and then you start solids and start formula. Have you found that? Somehow we have to be careful, I think, the way that we actually communicate that message, that we want to emphasise it's really good to continue breastfeeding while you're starting solids. The other thing about that age time is that the baby can sit up, which makes it safer in terms of choking. I mean, they're not able usually to sit unsupported, but they can sit supported. And that also means that they can more easily reach out for food and they can be involved in that feeding process. And there's some research that suggests that the gag reflex either becomes less sensitive at that time or just moves a bit further back in the mouth, but it still functions as a safety mechanism. It's really important, isn't it, that it basically brings any food that's not sufficiently chewed to be safely swallowed back to the front of the mouth or out of the mouth. And I think it's really important that we help parents understand the difference between gagging and choking, because often I think they're not necessarily clear about that difference. And I think it's really good if they can do these first aid courses that enable them to be somehow confident of dealing if it was really choking. We know that if you're starting around about that time, you don't need to coax a child to look at food, because they've started looking at it around about 4 or 5 months, watching people eat. And by 6 months, they're actually reaching out and grabbing objects and chewing on them. And they have the good eye and hand coordination that enables them actually to reach out, pick up the food and take it to their mouth. And Charlotte Wright looked back at the Millennium Study, and they reanalyzed some of the data from that and found that actually the majority of children at around 6 months have the skills to do that, and that sometimes it's that parents haven't been giving them the opportunities to do it. There are some babies who maybe have developmental delay that we need to watch out for, but on the whole, babies are able to do that. And that feeding themselves develops, again, new skills as they do that. Their tongue in the first few months basically goes back and forth and up and down, but it can't move food round the mouth. You know, baby doesn't need teeth to eat solids, but they do need to be able to gum the food. And that begins to happen around about six months or so, and they have that initial munching action that they do. And that's why actually if they do start before, they do need purees, because actually they can only cope with liquids, the action of the tongue. But if they start at 6 months, they don't need to necessarily go through the puree stage at all. They're also able to take food off the spoon without constantly pushing it out. Have you seen babies, if you watch on YouTube or something, parents trying to feed their babies, they're pushing their food out with their tongue all the time. But round about 6 months, that tongue thrust becomes less prominent. And they're also able to swallow solid foods. They don't swallow all of it at the beginning. They might swallow just a little. But babies learn to gum and to gnaw before they learn to swallow. So they actually get the skills in the right order, if you like, to deal with solid food. And so they can cope with that lumpier food from the beginning, and that means it's less work for mum. Many of us have, seen mums who make purees, spend hours making purees, and the babies don't really want to know about them. So being able to use healthy family food, and obviously that means checking with the parents what they're eating and what they're doing with the food that they're eating, can make a lot less work for mum, especially when they're out and about, but even at home. And there's evidence that breastfed babies are more likely to accept new tastes because they're used to having different flavours all the time in the breast milk. And so if you wait till then, the advantage too is that babies can eat almost anything, and they can use healthy family foods. And I think it's a real opportunity actually to encourage healthy eating for the whole family, and encouraging the parents to be not saying do what I say but do what I do. I think you will be sent, if you haven't already, a copy of our Milk and More pack. And what we did in one of the appendices was to summarise some of the social marketing research that's been done about different families in England and their eating styles and the sort of challenges that they may have with feeding their children and the things that are really good about that. It makes really interesting reading, I think, if you haven't seen that already. But it's a really important time. We know that parents' eating habits and attitudes to eating can all too easily influence the children, and indeed grandparents. If the grandmother's really involved, that her attitudes will tend to also influence. So I think it's looking at the whole family and taking that opportunity to see how we can improve the skills of that family, how we can improve the variety of different foods they eat, and things like cook and eat sessions are really great for that, I think. And of course, at that age, babies are really eager to feed themselves. They don't have to be told twice to reach out and put something in their mouth. The research that has been done so far about baby-led weaning actually suggests that the mums who tend to do it, although initially they're a bit unsure about whether the babies will be able to do it, are actually quite amazed how adept their child is. Interestingly enough, they did one piece of research and all the mums, I think, said that at one point they felt their baby had choked on something. Quite often it seemed to be raw apple. But in every instance, that baby had actually dealt with that himself. And in retrospect, it possibly was gagging rather than choking. But I think sometimes we as health professionals might be more sceptical than the mums who've actually tried it. And certainly, I've met quite a lot of mums who've tried baby-led weaning and found it really kind of decreases their anxiety, because they do see how able their children are. And I'm sure many of you have seen that too, hopefully. And the baby has a real great sense of achievement. They don't care they've got tomato sauce all over their face. They're just happy that they're involved in the eating process, and they're developing and they're interacting with their environment and building up those relationships. So those three signs that we can look for together are that sitting and holding their head steady, picking up the food and putting it in their mouth, and then when they can swallow some, so they're not still pushing it all out with their tongue. When those three things come together, that's a good sign to start offering some food. There's no evidence actually that offering food earlier than that increases the degree to which a baby might be content, or the degree to which they'll sleep, despite the myth out there that starting solids early does that. And I think the other thing it's important to talk through with some parents is that actually it's not a sign of more intelligence to start early, which I think sometimes, there's a bit of competition, isn't there, between parents about who's doing what first, but actually it's worth waiting. So how can we help? Mary Rudolph did a very useful review of a lot of evidence, and I think I found that very helpful when she took ways in which to decrease the obesity that we're seeing, really, because that has to start really early, given the number of children that are already overweight by the time they start primary school. And one of the ways is actually helping parents read those hunger cues, and also helping read those cues that say, I've had enough. And not insisting that the child has to finish what's on the plate. Helping them to model the good eating and trying out different foods, and avoiding both restricting what they eat and the amount that they eat, and pressurizing them to eat. Either end of the spectrum, if you like. One in a way is a fear of the child being overweight, and the other is a fear of the child being underweight. Actually, neither of them work to reduce the likelihood of obesity, because they actually override that child's ability to regulate their own intake and to know when they're full and to follow those cues. So we want them to follow the baby's pace and the cues. Wait for that baby to open the mouth, for the spoon if they're spoon feeding, and if they're turning their head away, if they're pushing the food away, if they're pursing their mouth, all of those are signs I've had enough. And then encouraging a relaxed approach, so praising good eating, not making a big deal of the child not eating something, trying not to use food as rewards, some of us still think the way to relax is a cup of tea and a biscuit or a piece of chocolate. Actually, we'd rather our children didn't learn the same thing, because it's much harder to control. And then helping them to look at what the baby eats over a week rather than a day. Healthy children do not starve themselves. And I think, helping the parent to look for other signs that they're healthy, they're active, they're interested in the environment, all of those kind of things, rather than just focusing on the amount that they eat or the weight, is probably more helpful. I mean, obviously we need to weigh them, but we need to help parents understand the centiles too, and not to expect that every child will be on the 50th centile, which they sometimes do. And if they're not interested, wait till the next meal time. That's quite important, and not to feel you've got to give something high sugar or whatever in between. And then the whole process of, we've talked about the importance of building those relationships through food that happens with breastfeeding and bottle feeding. That's also important with starting on solids. And we know that children and babies will eat more if they're eating with other people. They'll be more likely to try other foods if they're with other people watching them eat those foods. So sitting the baby up to eat from the safety point of view, but also actually to be eating with them and helping them learn from watching other people eat. Hopefully also learning socialization, learning language skills, learning maybe good manners, depending on the families, good manners or otherwise, but learning a lot more than just actually about taking food, and letting them participate in those meals, and then even in the preparation as they get older. We know that children involved in cooking is actually a meal or preparing a meal are more likely to eat that meal. And then avoiding those distractions, the TV. And I think, we know that family meals are less common now than they were, but we also know that if children are having family meals, that there's not just short-term effects for good eating, but actually long-term effects on their eating, that years down the line, they're more likely to have a healthy eating lifestyle and less likely to be overweight. So, actually encouraging those family meals and talking to families about how that could happen is really crucial. And then be prepared for the messy eating. I think the research that's been done, and I think we all know that actually it's going to be messy at some stage, whenever that child starts to feed itself, it will be messy. At this stage, if they're 6-7 months, it's much easier to contain the mess than if you don't start till they're 13, 15, 16 months, when they can run around and spread the mess everywhere. So actually, if they can be prepared with a bib and putting the food maybe on the clean high chair surface rather than in a dish, that stage, aren't they, when they're throwing things and then looking for it quite soon. So thinking about how to reduce the impact of the mess, but actually recognizing that playing, what they sometimes see as playing with the food, touching food, feeling the texture and the shape and the color, is actually part of that learning process and an important part of their development. So just very briefly, getting started. Start with a meal a day, preferably when the baby's not too tired or too hungry, and then build up to 3 meals and 2 healthy snacks by a year. Remembering that the tummy's small, so they need frequent smaller meals. And then I don't think we don't yet have enough evidence to say it should only be finger foods. There are many parents who've done that and seem to found that really works. I think the review that I was mentioning earlier, and I think many of us think it would be really good to have some kind of randomized controlled trial of baby-led weaning, to be absolutely sure that if you give babies just finger foods, that will be adequate. What is really important is you give a wide variety of foods. So you don't want the baby to start at 6 months and still only be having fruit and vegetables by the time they're 8 months. And the good thing about baby-led weaning and giving them kind of finger-shaped pieces of food is that you can give almost anything in that form. It could be cheese, it could be meat, it could be a piece of fish, it could be a piece of hard-boiled egg. So all the protein foods, but also all the carbohydrate foods, and as well as your fruit and vegetables, can be put in that format. And we know that the baby's doing this, aren't they? They're scooping and eating what sticks out. at that 6-month stage, they can't yet open their mouth and their hand and take the food out of it. But there's no reason why you also can't offer food on a spoon, and sometimes there may be instances if the baby's unwell when that might be appropriate for a time, or if there's some developmental delay, but I don't think it necessarily has to be one or the other, although the baby may often be more keen to feed themselves than to be fed. And then the wide variety of food and increasing the lumpiness quickly. So if you do start with mashed, if the parent does start with mashed food on a spoon, quickly going to more lumpy food is important, because we know that from studies that have been done, if you wait till 10 or 11 months to start introducing lumps of any significance, it can be much more difficult for the child to accept them. And, you know, if you look at some of these, how many of these pouches do you see around now? Children in pushchairs sucking out of the pouch. And apparently they're even producing them so you can put your own food in them very soon, if not yet. And I think it's something that we need to talk about, because actually this is a second stage food. I'll pass it around. There's no lumps in it whatsoever. It's puree. But also it encourages the child to suck, which from the feeding skills point of view is no good, but also from the teeth point of view is not good. So I think it's something to talk about. Yeah, 5 minutes. Okay, sure. I can pass that around actually, but just for you to have a see. But there's so many of them out there because I think it's really convenient. But I think we need to actually be having those conversations with parents about when it's appropriate to use them. And then, I'm sure you know that babies react to a new food by actually spitting it out in the initial stages, and that they can, you know, it's worth offering it up to 15 times, 20 times before you decide actually they really don't like it. But again, if parents don't know that, they will assume that that spitting out will be, I don't like it, and end up with basically nothing that they can give. So that's really important to understand. And then offering small quantities. If you put one of the factors perhaps in our obesity epidemic is that children are being given adult-sized plates and adult-sized portions. And I think that's perhaps especially true if parents are using more convenience foods. But actually, if a child is given a big plate of food, it will often put them off completely. There's almost like a physical reaction in them to that huge plate of food. So it's much better to offer them smaller quantities, you know, a couple of teaspoons, a tablespoon to start with, and add to it if they finish that, than to put huge quantities in front of them. And I think it's still true that the size of the fist is quite a good guide about the portion size all the way through childhood. And the importance too of helping parents get their children off a bottle if they're on a bottle, and help them know that actually they don't need to be on a bottle at all if they're breastfeeding, that they can go straight onto a cup for other fluids, whether it's water or milk, and that it should be one of the free-flowing cups, either an open cup or one with a free-flow spout, not with the non-spill ones where they have to suck. There's a lot of things actually around that encourage babies to suck rather than to learn to eat or to learn to drink properly. And then weaning them off bottles and dummies by a year. So what do they need? Well, basically they need all the different food groups. So milk is still a major source of nutrition into that second year. And of course, if they're breastfeeding, it continues to provide a significant amount of protection all the time they're breastfeeding. But they also do need food from all the food groups. We know that their needs for iron, their needs for other micronutrients and other energy and things like that increase around about 6 or 7 months. So they're going to need the other foods to get in those extra nutrients. They won't eat masses at 6 months, but by 9 months they should be eating a significant quantity of different foods. Protein foods, starchy foods, your fruit and vegetables. And there's just, when you start then, just a few guidelines. So important to use whole milk. Skimmed milk is not suitable till the child's 5, and semi-skimmed till they're 2. And I think that we have to maybe also talk to parents for that, because it's the opposite of what we're saying for children over 5 and adults, isn't it? But actually it's important that they have the whole milk, because it's a really good source of energy without bulk, because it's, you know, that's the way fat is. It's non-bulky energy, but it's also they carry the fat soluble vitamins. And then cutting up any coin-shaped or small round food, so that could be anything like a plum, you know, a baby tomato or a grape, but it could also be a sausage or a piece of apple or something, you know, something that's round. Important to cut that up, or even mash it maybe, but it depends what it is, and make sure that egg is well cooked. And there's very few things they need to avoid, basically salt and sugar, and those kind of snacks. Honey in the first year because of botulism. Reduced calorie or low fat food, again, that's not suitable for under 5s, because they need the fat in the food. Not, when I say fat in the food, not your chips and Cornish pasties or whatever, but dairy foods and things like that, and fish and so on, that they will get good nutrients from. And very high fibre food is also not suitable for them, because it's too bulky and fills up their tummies too quickly. And then tea and coffee, as well as being stimulants, will actually reduce the absorption of vitamins. And they can have ground nuts, but not whole nuts until they're 5. And there's several milks that actually, I think more and more we see parents, don't we, buying milks off the internet, especially people from you know, some of the Eastern European countries and so on, and it's hard to know what kind of milk they are, or some milks are seen as healthier, like goat's milk, but actually they're not suitable for children as the main milk. Rice because of levels of arsenic, soya milk because it contains plant estrogens that are not thought to be advisable in those early days of the developing reproductive system. They also have a lot of sugar in soya, and goat's milk because it's just not the right constituents. And then vitamin drops. And I think more and more we're realising how crucial they are. Islington now offers vitamin drops free to every child under 5 and every pregnant and breastfeeding woman, because of the evidence of increasing, especially vitamin D deficiency. And you know, I'm sure you know that the baby gets their stores of vitamin D from their mum during pregnancy, and if her stores are low, they won't get those stores. They're not designed to get vitamin D from breast milk. We're designed to get it from the sunlight. And for all sorts of reasons, and I've listed some of them here, we have less opportunity to do that now. And that's why it's really important that however healthy the diet is the mum feels she's giving her child, vitamin drops are still really important for the baby, child, and vitamin tablets for her. And this is what we want, isn't it? Fun, make them something that's enjoyable, eating together, and actually fulfilling all those needs, having that happy child with good relationships, a healthy, active child able to enjoy life and explore their environment, and somewhere where food is something enjoyable and appropriate as well. And I've just given you here a list of some of the resources. In Islington, as I said, we did the Milk and More pack, which we tried to bring together the information about breastfeeding, bottle feeding, starting on solids, oral health, sort of simple cooking and putting a meal together, as well as appendices that covered things like food intolerance that parents often asked about in classes. So what you've got is key messages, and the information to go with them, and then you've got lesson plans that you could use in a group setting, or even in a one-to-one. You could just take a small section, and other things that you can use, quizzes and so on that you can use. And I think you're going to get sent that as a PDF if you want that. We also did 4 leaflets in Islington. One on this is generally on starting on solids. This is on vitamins and minerals and the good food sources of them. This one is on snacking, and it also includes kind of ideas about healthy eating habits and what to do if you think your child's fussy eater. And this one's about drinks. And they are translated into 7 other languages as PDFs. So feel free to come and have a look afterwards, and we could send you those of you felt that would be helpful. And I've got a copy of our recipe book that went with the pack for each of you. So, and it's basically recipes, quite a few from the Baby-Led Weaning cookbook, and some with permission, and some from our Islington Healthy Schools cookbook that are suitable for the 6-month-old, but also for the rest of the family. And I can, just a couple of references I've given you on the next page. The ones with the star, which you'll find on your hand, not the handout you've got, but we'll send you another handout. Actually, they're really good sources, but I'd really recommend these two. Okay, sorry, that was a very quick, rather rushed whiz tour, but...
Thank you very much, Rosemary. Now, we're really running out of time, I'm afraid, but is there one urgent question anybody's got that they would like to pose to Rosemary? Going, gone. Rosemary, thank you. But look at the beautiful resources that Rosemary's made available. So thank you very much indeed. What I've decided to do is we're going to just go straight on, and you have your tea right at the end, all right? So that we don't lose out.